Welcome, everybody. This is the Rotary eClub of Silicon Valley. Every week, we work to bring you the stories of people who are making a difference in small and large ways around the world through all sorts of fascinating topics, a focus on Rotary's mission of service above self and possibilities for how we see the world. As the Rotary eClub of Silicon Valley, we have a special set of interests. Those are education, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And we've got several of those topics being covered by our speaker today. Our speaker is Dr. Giuseppe Ugazio. He is the Edmund de Rothschild Assistant Professor in Behavioral Philanthropy at the Geneva Finance Research Institute. And that overlap between philanthropy and neuropsychological mechanisms is one that we are excited to hear about. We are excited to have you with us. Thank you for joining us, which is for me a little late at night, 9 p.m. And I will hand the mic over to you, Giuseppe. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Rushton. It's such a pleasure to be here. Hello, everybody. It's great to meet you. And I'm going to share some of my research today with you. And the title of the presentation is Moral and Financial Values in the Brain. So as Rushton mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in behavioral philanthropy. So what I try to do in my research is to understand what motivates people to engage in philanthropy. And you being members of a Rotary Club maybe have also something to contribute, since I know that you're contributing a lot to philanthropy by doing it yourselves. So let me start with a fairly simple situation that actually depicts a very complex decision to make. Consider organ donations. This is maybe something that people consider one of the most altruistic decision you can make. It's to donate your organs, not let alone if you're still in life, right? So if you're dead, it's already altruistic. But imagine if you would donate a kidney when you're still in life. And for most people, this decision is an inherently moral decision. Money should never come into the picture when you're making such a decision. However, for other people, this is not the case. And there are also states around the world where a market for organs exists and is actually regulated. This situation depicts very well altruism at its peak, but also, in general, philanthropy, sustainable finance, or all those situations in which the decision we have to make rely on two things: moral preferences and financial values. And in one case, like in this case, it could be that people are giving up some moral components, say an organ, to receive money, or in other situations like philanthropy, what's more typical is that people would give up their money, their material goods, in order to bring about some moral value they believe in. So to take a step back, as I mentioned, I'm really interested in understanding what motivates philanthropy. So when we're engaging in charity, other forms of philanthropy, or when we're doing actions, engaging entrepreneurially in promoting the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, what is it that motivates us? And as I hinted with my example before, I think there are two main components: moral preferences on one hand, financial or material preferences on the other hand. And when we're making decisions in this context, what we're doing is a trade-off between these two. But this could probably seem pretty obvious to most of us, especially if we're used to make these decisions. But as a researcher, one of the key questions that I think is important to answer if we want to understand how we're making these decisions is, are actually moral and material values equivalent? And by say equivalent, I mean, is our brain or our decision processes at the psychological level treating these two inputs in a similar scale or not? I'm going to argue that today that no, we're not doing that. And I'll give you first just some intuitive evidence for it. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some results from research that I've done that actually supports this view. The first one is related to a book that Michael Sandel's published in 2012 and has many examples of what money can buy. So suppose I'm going to a park and I see a friend who has a very nice camera. And I happen to have 1,000 francs or dollars in my pocket, and I really like this camera, so I approach my friend and I just offer a bargain. Would you trade your camera for this amount of money? And while it could be weird that I'm approaching a friend and asking this thing, I think most of us would consider this transaction sort of a normal one. People could argue whether the price is right or not, but no one would have moral concerns when I'm proposing such a trade-off. Now, suppose that I just went to the bank. Here in Switzerland, you can withdraw a lot of money, and I have $1,000,000 or dollars in my pockets. And I still see my friends, and this time what I'm really interested in buying is not anymore this object, but actually, I really like kids, so I would like to buy his daughter. Now, the intuition that most people have, for sure I have, when I see a bargain like this is that something is wrong here. It's wrong to try to buy like a human life, something is a sacred value with money. And not only is it wrong and counterintuitive that people could do this, but if I were to observe this transaction, I would actually think less in moral terms of the person proposing this transaction. So while this is just an intuitive thought experiment, I think it gives the idea that there might be something at the level of the brain processes that actually are representing these two types of values in different ways. So when I'm trying to mix the two, something is odd. Let me give you another example that sort of suggests that these two values are not the same. Consider what's called moral crowding out. So, and I'm going to tell you in a second what a more precise definition of it. But just to give you an intuition, so suppose I have a situation where I'm offered two options. They're both entailing only material values. On one hand, I can get a sandwich, and on the other hand, I can get a sandwich plus 5 francs. Now, all economists, and I think most people in any case, would tell me that the choice on the right, so the sandwich plus 5 francs, strongly dominates the choice on the left, and everybody will most likely choose the option on the right, unless they're making some errors. Now, if I take these examples and I then consider, suppose I give you an option with only moral value and an option with moral value plus some material value, would you find still that this second option, so the moral plus material value, strictly dominates the second one? So an experiment has actually been done here in Switzerland by Frey and Jägen in the early 2000s, where they asked people to vote on whether they wanted to accept the government's decision of storing nuclear waste in their commune. And this was basically something that people actually had to choose, not in the commune where the experiment was done, but people were told, the government identified your location as the best place to store this toxic waste. Would you incur this civic cost of having this waste in your commune? And what they found is that a minor majority actually accepted this, 50.8%. Now, the researchers then went on and asked the same thing, but in this case, they framed it a little bit different. They said not only the government identified this place to be the best to store the toxic waste, but also, the government knows you're going to pay a cost. So the government is offering you 2,000 francs or dollars, more or less the same, on top of it. Would you accept to have the toxic waste stored in your place? And now, if you recall from before, if the second option strictly dominates the second, we should have seen an increase of how many people accept this proposal. But what was actually found is a decrease by 50%, right? Only 25% now accept this. So it seems that when you're mixing material and moral values, this phenomenon of crowding out happens. And this means that by inserting something that is not related to moral values, you're corrupting the moral intrinsic motivation of doing something. Hereby, you crowd out the intrinsic motivation to do it, and you observe actually the opposite effect of what you would suppose happen. Now, for me, the more interesting question is now, can we actually quantify how these intuitions? Can we find a way to measure, is the brain representing these two types of values differently? That seems to be doing so by just looking at these toy examples. So one way to do this is to ask participants to come to an MRI scanner and ask them to make choices between financial values. And for us, in this case, was intertemporal choice, which means we're asking people to make decisions about money that they can receive today or larger amount of money that they can receive later. On the other hand, we also asked them to make decisions about moral values, and in this case was human lives. So we asked them, would you prefer to save the life of one person to sacrifice the life of one person in order to save a larger amount of lives? And this is what's typically called in moral psychology trolley dilemma or moral philosophy. Basically, you're faced with the decision whether you think it's morally correct to harm fewer number of people to save more. And for me, it's not important what the people answer, it's more how do people get to this conclusion. In the case of material values, whether it's money, food, and beauty, neuroeconomics gives us a very precise account of what happens or how these decisions are made. Basically, the brain is representing the value of each of these two preferences and is making a trade-off, and whichever of these two has a stronger value will be more strongly represented in this area that is called the medial prefrontal cortex among a network of different areas that also frequently referred to as the common neural currency hypothesis. Basically, you find a common currency in the brain that allows you to make trade-offs about material values. So my question here is, in my experiment, the novelty of it is, are moral values represented by this neural currency? And what we find is no. What we find is that when we're making decision about trade-offs for sacrificing the life of one person in order to save more, we're engaging a different set of brain areas. And I can note here the right TPJ, the transcranial parietal junction, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. These are two brain areas that are frequently found to be processing social mechanisms such as empathy, theory of mind, which means putting yourself in the shoes of others, and so on. So a network of regions that has nothing to do with the computation of material values, but rather of regulating social interactions. So to conclude, we find in our study that material and moral values are represented differently in the brain, which seems to suggest that these are actually different also at the psychological level. So we provide some evidence that basically measures this intuition that when we're mixing the two, there is something at odds going on that our brain doesn't like, and has to make some steps in order to make decisions when we're mixing these two. And since this is a very sort of basic science and a bit abstract, I also wanted to give you some practical implications for philanthropy of these results. So first of all, we can target individual differences in the sensitivity to these different types of incentives. Say I can promote moral values or financial values. I can see who is more sensitive to each of these two to try to then target use this sensitivity at the individual level to increase the likelihood that people engage in philanthropy. Say if someone is more careful about his finances or her finances, I can promote maybe with nudges or other choice architecture strategies. I can increase that. Vice versa, if someone is more morally oriented, they can enhance the relevance of the moral value of the decision. Other implications is that I can study how to complement different kinds of incentives. So I could mix, say, promoting the moral value of promoting education or reducing gender inequalities with tax incentives that sort of give also financial reasons to engage in philanthropic activities that promote these moral values. However, we want to anticipate and avoid crowding out effects. We saw before that there are situations where you mix these incentives and you have counterproducing results. By measuring how these are represented in the brain or at the behavioral level, we can anticipate our crowding out effects and make sure that the incentives are complementary. I end here, and I thank you very much for your attention. I'll leave you also our website and my email in case you want to reach out at a later stage. And I'm very happy to start the discussion with you now.
Excellent. Thank you, Giuseppe. All right, so I want to introduce the folks that we have on the recording. And so if you would, go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and we'll get ourselves up in our gallery view. We have with us, in addition to Giuseppe joining us from Switzerland, we have Jens, a member who is in Germany. We have Heather in Oregon, Chanel in Georgia, Farheen in California, I am in California, and Pamela, who is in Maryland. So we have a group of folks who have lots of questions kind of lined up for you. And we will start with Jens. Jens, if you'd like to unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
It was basically just, I mean, I actually around 2006 worked at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, so for a little while as an intern, and we worked on similar things. And so what we back then we also found, I mean, that this is very strongly dependent on framing, and we looked, for example, at economic effects, and also because the debate was also pretty active in Germany at the time on nuclear waste storage, etc., where there have been a lot of studies in Japan. Obviously, this was all before the Fukushima Daiichi incident, so those probably have changed since then. But what we found back then was mostly that the economic value was kind of perceived, and that this was very, very strongly dependent on whether people saw this as basically the government bribing them to accept the presence of this, versus just saying, you know, this does profit the region. And I was just wondering, have you looked into that?
Yeah, so thanks. It's a great question, and so I agree. This is one of the earlier papers that I study that studied this. And it's for sure is not immune for shortcomings. And it's great that you worked on follow-up studies that looked at in a bit more nuanced way the trade-off. But so this is going back to my last point, that it's, you know, crowding out effects exist, and we need to precisely understand how to calibrate both the financial and the moral incentives in order for each other to complement and not to sort of counteract each other. So I agree that when you frame it in a different way, you could have this complementarity, so that economic incentives help. And that's the case also for instance, in many cases of tax incentives, especially the matching mechanism that works in promoting philanthropy well, so it doesn't have this detrimental effect. And also this paper that I mentioned, the Frey and Yegin paper that looked here in Switzerland, had a sort of a framing effect that's referred to as the sequence effect, right? So they ask people first one question and then the other question.
Yeah.
It's kind of, you know,
it looks even more like, but would you be okay if we gave you money for that? Right. And then that kind of does trigger, you know, are you trying to bribe me with that?
Exactly as you say.
Yeah.
So for me, that's not a problem, in the sense that I just use this study to make people realize that crowding out happens, and, you know, in some contexts, and just to make a simple point. It's not a defense of that paper. I don't know, has some issues, but I think it's really important to study all these conditions or situations where you mix moral and financial values to make sure that we can make the most out of both incentives.
Excellent. Heather, I believe you have a question.
Thank you, and thank you for your talk. I'm wondering your opinion on, here in the US, we have some resistance to vaccination, and many states are now incentivizing, either by enrolling folks in lotteries, or in some states offering them guns as a prize for getting vaccinated. And I'm wondering what you think about incentivizing what I feel is a moral imperative for participating and existing in a shared society.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. My philosophical opinion, I agree with you, and I also agree, you know, to do your moral duty, protect the others, and get your vaccines, get vaccinated. That's what's recommended to do, and we know it's a good thing to do. However, we know that in many situations, also ourselves, we don't always do what we should do. And the good thing of giving these incentives is that it brings people who would not just follow their sort of their conscience or their moral values to actually and do the right thing. And the same way we have a lot of nudges, so similar incentives to contribute to our pension schemes. That's, you know, even if you consider it's even a weirder situation, right? That we have our best interest is to save for our pension, and we still need incentives or ways to do it in the right way. So I think they're good incentives because they achieve their end, but philosophically, I would agree with you that it would be better if people would just do it after their moral duty.
All right, Chanel, I think you have a question.
Wonderful presentation. I really love the information that was presented. So one of your first slides, you actually alluded to organ donorship. And it's a funny story for me. I got my license when I was 22 years old, and there was, okay, if you signed up to be an organ donor, it was this price. And if you were not an organ donor, it was this price. So I took, hey, I want some money off my license. So I did sign up to be an organ donor. But throughout the years and I've matured, I actually am proud to be an organ donor. And every April, I do celebrate Donate Life Month. And the current company I work for is CryoLife. That's actually what we do. We actually do organ donorship, as well as we create devices for people who are struggling with heart disease and whatnot. But my question is going to be to you. In addition to the brain activity, have you accounted also for past experiences with charitable giving? I started charitable giving like from a religious perspective, but now I'm a donor and I actually support 3 different charitable organizations just because I am proud to be part of it. So how much of the research has been alluded to people who actually have done it in the past, or they seen it in their families? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I haven't looked too much at the role of experience, if you want to call it like that, in determining charitable giving. But I'm sure it will play a role. For me, the really interesting question to answer is, we know experience plays a role in decisions that we make in every domain: medical, financial, choosing the best way to get from A to B. The interesting question is, does it play the same role, or is it supported by the same mechanisms? So is experience in philanthropy in the brain represented the same way that experience in going from A to B is represented, or is it different? So that would be a very interesting question to answer, but I don't have an answer to that.
No, thank you so much for your insight.
Thanks for your positive feedback on the presentation. Much appreciated.
Pamela, you're next.
I don't know if I have a question, because apologies for coming in late. So I was trying to catch up on the slides and everything. So what I saw was really good. So I had a question. I actually was going to kind of piggyback on what Heather said, because I was thinking that. But in terms of morality, I think it's really, it's nuanced. And I don't, you know, how people perceive morality, whether good intentions or not, is dependent upon, you know, a lot of factors. And I think in this country, because we have so many different, we're diverse and we're struggling with that diversity as it relates to equity and inclusion. And so I think morality, for instance, for some of my family members who are African-American who live in the South, are struggling, you know, with, is it moral for them to have to be forced to, you know, take a vaccine and even get money, you know? That's, so balancing those nuances, you know, it doesn't mean that they're, you know, I think horrible people, but they're just struggling with past experiences, I think, you know, going on past things, and also may or may not be fully educated on a lot of things in terms of research and, you know, how the vaccines are rolled out. But to your earlier point about empathy, I guess in the brain, how does that empathy with people who, like Heather said, are getting guns to take the vaccine, you know, how would you see that registering with somebody who just really have had a moral dilemma due to past discretions against them?
So it's a great point. I'm gonna maybe take a bit of a tangent, and let me know if I'm not answering your question.
Okay.
So the bigger point that we want to make in this study is that moral preferences frequently are considered like, you know, things that you will never change over your life. They're like established. You would never kill someone. What we actually show is that in our task is that people change their preference. So, you know, when you are asked, would you kill this one person to say 4, they say no. And then when we increase the lives, we can measure where they would switch their preference. So we show that, you know, moral preferences are not as strongly grounded. They're more like, say, you know, would you like rock music or pop music. At some point, you may change them, right? They're not as set in stone as people think to be. And what I want to get at here is that we are all on a spectrum. It's not preference black or preference white, but it's all these personal attitudes or factors that we have, like empathy, would determine how we make choices in different situations. So someone more empathic would decide that he could kill someone only when you can really save a lot of people, but he would still switch. And someone less empathic would switch later. Now, to come to your back to the experience point and to your point about personal experience, it's possible that because you've already been in such a situation where you were forced to do something that you don't understand why, then you're more reluctant to do it. Doesn't mean that you're a bad person. Just mean that because of your history, your sort of context things that factor into the decision will be different from individual to individual. And quantifying all this will help us understand a bit better how moral preferences are formed and regulated. So I hope this answered the questions a bit. Sort of a more philosophical answer, but I think that's the best way to see this is not seeing moral preferences as completely determined, and that once you have them, you will never change them, but they will change. It's just that the way we are as individuals will determine how and when they will change.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Thanks.
Thank you.
Giuseppe, when you think of something a little less dramatic, so for example, tax incentives for donations to recognized charities, that's a part of the structure here in the United States. Donations are tax incentivized in a fashion. Have you looked at that as a topic compared to countries where that may not be present?
So I've not done comparisons across countries on this topic. What we have done. So I know there are some studies that look at it, but it's really complex because there are very different schemes. There are different ways of incentivizing. So I think the US has a rebate system where you donate first and then you can subtract part of that or all of it from your annual income. And I think the same in Switzerland. In the UK, you can actually have schemes where the state would match your donation. So you can give up to a certain amount and then people would, the government would match that. So there are different schemes, so that makes it harder to compare. What I've done, though, is to try to understand which of the different schemes work better. And I know match and rebate are the two most common schemes. So we're looking at, if we have a match scheme compared to a rebate scheme, which of these two mechanisms to lay people like us, so that, or at least like me, that don't have someone who does the taxes for him and can make all the computations of what's the ideal amount of donations. So for people, for individuals, we find that matching works better than a rebate in this as a type of incentive. So people would give more if I know there is this matching incentive than if in the rebate case. And not only that, but if we count the cost that the government would have to incur for the rebate, we find that it's actually worse than having no incentive. So the government, because the rebate effect is so little, the government then is paying some money that then is decreasing the total amount that the government is receiving in taxes or that the charities are. It's not basically compensating for the increase in contribution to charities. So that's a piece of work that we've looked at on tax incentives.
Got it. For our last question, let's go back to Heather.
Thank you. This dovetails Rushton's question about incentivized giving. Have you done any research in philanthropy about whether or not there's a long-standing tradition of what we see as exploiting poverty and marketing with images of suffering? And have you done research about what is more effective? Because what I've read over the years is that while that does emote things and make people feel things, that doesn't necessarily translate to writing a check and making that donation, but focusing on success and outcomes gives people more hope and incentivizes them to give more, instead of this, there's poverty everywhere and the world is hopeless, I can't make a difference. So have you done research about which is more effective?
So I haven't done research directly. I've looked into these studies because we are doing a different, a study that piggybacks on this together with the International Red Cross. So sometimes to pass me the term, it's called victims porn, right? That you just slap a suffering kid on this flyer in order to get money. And we know that eliciting negative emotions many times elicits some reaction, but that doesn't transform into this sort of compassionate intervention of helping others. So this way of fundraising is not very effective, and at least at the level of the International Red Cross, they know it doesn't work very well. Now, our research, we looked into this because we're developing virtual reality modules that we want to compare to traditional videos or flyers to see if they would be more effective. So to try really to have a very strong empathic response and emotional response in people. And I had to decide whether to focus on the negative emotions. Say, you're in this reality where you experience a war zone. Would you see a victim dying, or would you be able to help this victim at the end of the story? So that's what the literature we reviewed, it seems that the latter. So when you have a positive impact, it's what should work best. We're going to directly test this again in our approach, in our experiments. But we would expect, yes, that's positive emotions and giving a sense of not only of managing to do something, but of usefulness. It's that you're doing something that is useful is what will lead people then to contribute more to these causes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Giuseppe. So for everyone watching, we are winding down, but we ask that you do two things before you finish up. If you are on our meeting page, that is to scroll down just a little bit more. There's a place where you can tell us you are here. It's always good to know who we've got. We'll send a thanks or something along those lines if we're organized enough. Bit of a caveat there. But if you put in your email address properly, you will receive an email that you can pass along to your club secretary to make up a miss if you are working honorably to keep up 100% attendance with Rotary. Additionally, at the bottom, you will see that we have a forum, and we ask for you to share your thoughts. What kinds of questions came up for you as a result of this presentation? Perhaps other content in the meeting is material that you stopped and thought, that's something I want to ask a question about. Maybe somebody else's comment in the forum was such that you want to respond to it. You can do so. We ask for everyone who gets involved to engage with us in that fashion. As we always do, we hand it back to our speaker for a final word. So if, Giuseppe, you have a final thought that you'd like people to walk away with, feel free to let us know now.
Well, thank you so much for giving me this great opportunity. I hope it was inspiring. If you have any work that you're doing, any philanthropic work that you're doing that you would like to get a more scientific angle to, and that you think we could do some research together, I'm always trying to build a bridge between what we call the ivory tower of academia and the real world. So I'd be very happy if any of my research could contribute to understand better your philanthropy.
Excellent. Thank you again. And for everybody, we will see you